Welcome, everybody. Thank you for spending your evening with us talking about the Blue Line extension. I'm Sophia Guinness. I'm with Metro Transit and I've been on this project for quite some time. And with me is Dan Solar with Hennepin County, who will also be helping to give the presentation and answering questions. And sitting next to him in the room, just off camera, is also my colleague, Kathy Gold, who's listening in and also is a great resource on the project team. So a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the presentation itself. If you can, please stay muted. Well, if you're not asking a question, that'll just help with the overall audio quality of the call. And we are going to basically do about 25 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have tons of time for questions in discussion. And so there's a couple ways for folks to ask questions, and you don't have to wait till the very end to ask them, but the chat function is available to you. So just putting a question into chat, we'll take a bunch of them. And then when we get to the end of the presentation, and have just open question and answer. You can also, there's kind of a raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and you can feel free to raise your hand and unmute and have some conversation with us on that. So with that, kind of what we're going to talk tonight is I'm going to give you a little bit of a project overview. Dan's going to jump in and talk about some of the findings from our draft route modification report, which is where we are right now. And then we'll talk a little bit about our parallel effort to form an anti-displacement working group and kind of what that means and what we're trying to accomplish with that. So jumping right in with the project overview. So the Blue Line is an extension of the Blue Line extension is an extension of the Blue Line. So it's would be a one-seat ride all the way from Brooklyn Park all the way down to Mall of America or the airport. You could transfer to the rest of our metro network in downtown Minneapolis, as well as other locations along the way. And so this is just the part of increasing transit options to get around our region fast and efficiently, without the need to kind of know a schedule, right? Things are coming frequently. A little bit about the project schedule overall and where we are in the process. So many of you might have been hearing about this project for quite some time. In August of 2020, the project team, or the Hennepin County Met Council, made the decision to pivot the project to not use Freight Rail Corridor. So over this past year, we've been building up the details to select routes and kind of go from there. So in March of 2021, which is not this year anymore, I keep saying this year, but it's now 2022, we released potential route options and kind of asked, are there anything missing? Is this what we should be evaluating? We went more into potentially where stations could be and kind of the basic engineering of how LRT could fit into the communities themselves. And now we're at this place where we have the draft route modification report, and then we will be releasing another report in the spring that'll have the final recommendations and will bring us to the next step of the project. So to put that into context of where we are and how long it'll take, so we are in this year of identifying a community-supported route. We're kind of at the nearing the end, but not quite there. After we have a community-supported route, we still have multiple years where we'll need to conduct environmental analysis, as well as seek municipal consent from the cities. And that's municipal consent is a process in which we bring the design plans to the various municipalities and say, hey, is this what you're anticipating? Does this work? The environmental review is also a great time to just disclose all of the impacts and benefits, and where there are impacts, I really think about those mitigation items that help solve for those issues. After that, we'll still need some time to make our plans construction ready. And then we have 3 to 4 years of construction itself. And that doesn't mean that, wherever you live or that we would be, in the middle of the roadway the whole time. It just means that for the duration of the project, it takes that long, as well as things we do like systems works and testing and all that kind of stuff. So the earliest the line could open would be about 2028. To give a little bit more background on how we've kind of tackled this project over the last year and kind of the different questions that we have in different places. I think on the call tonight, I'm assuming we have folks from Brooklyn Park to Minneapolis and everywhere in between, and in everybody's area is slightly different. So in Brooklyn Park, since we're not on the freight rail corridor, we were basically able to preserve all the work that had already occurred. So in that portion of the route, it's kind of validating, is this validating where we already were and maintaining the project as much as possible. In the pink area, the freight rail corridor paralleled County Road 81 for very closely for most of it. So it was looking at that if there was any other options besides County 81 that would make sense for LRT. And then in the blue area, which is Minneapolis, we was finding a route that would work and going through that process. And so I'll talk more about that in a second. So, but to build the options that we have on the table right now, we had a set of project principles. We looked at right away, kind of where does LRT work and fit and make sense, past work, as well as community feedback on destinations and connections. So that led us to this map right here. And this is the map that we've evaluated in the draft route modification report that Dan will discuss more in a second. And kind of like I said, you have your previous stations, and then you can see where stations at 63rd or Bass Lake Road closely align with what had been in previous plans. As you get into Robbinsdale, stations start to diverge, but you're able to serve that downtown area still, even though if you're slightly in a different place, as well as picking up the new connection of North Memorial Hospital. And so this part is kind of stations that would exist and in the routes that we're moving forward at the moment. And where we're trying to decide again is in Minneapolis, whether we're taking a Washington Lyndale route or a West Broadway Lyndale route or a Lowry Washington route. So the Lowry route is in the purple and the West Broadway is in the green. And those blue dots, those blue circles, are potential station areas. So as we advance the process, we'll get more into the details of where exactly we place those stations. We have some options available right now for people to review, but the step is to select the route and then get into more detail. All of this work that we've done so far has involved a lot of community involvement. We've talked to over 9,000 individuals over this past year and have gotten feedback in a variety of ways. And so all that work has helped to shape the report that Dan will go over in a second. We heard a lot of things, and there was just a couple themes that we heard pretty consistently throughout that I'll just take 1 second to call attention to, and that was to make decisions with a lens of fairness, to minimize direct property impacts, to really focus on pedestrian and station safety, and to think about the programs that will be needed to support businesses during construction so they can benefit from the line once it's complete. With that, hope Dan's ready to take over and talk a little bit about the draft route modification report.
There I am. Okay, I am here. Good. Thanks, Sophia, and good evening, everybody. Dan Solar from Hennepin County here today. So what you saw in the previous slide and what many of you may have seen before is our draft route modification report. And so as Sophia's provided the introduction to that, I mean, this becomes kind of the accumulation of a lot of the work that we did in 2021, which was, after we identified kind of the project goals, and then we identified what our potential routes would be, and then we did a lot of preliminary engineering on them. What the goal of the draft report is to take the technical information we gathered and public input that we've gotten, and from all of these engagement pieces that we've done, and evaluate. What it's attempted to do then is evaluate each route against the project principles and against the project goals. So the idea here is not to pick a final route. That will come in a final route modification report. The goal is not to compare alternatives to each other. The goal really is to compare the routes and how they meet against the project goals. Go ahead, Sophia. So when we did that, we looked at the various routes for the report, and we gave them a score against each project goal of poor, good, or excellent. Not a numeric score. There's no numbering piece here. If a piece of the route did not meet the project goals, one of the project goals, it rated as poor. If it met the project goals and provided the benefits as expected to, it was rated as good. And if there were some unique characteristics and it delivered some real positive benefits, those segments rated as excellent. So what you'll see here then, and what is the summary matrix from the report, is how area 2, the first column there, the first column is the 6 project goals that were identified for these routes. And the second column then identifies how the Bottineau, what we call the Bottineau route, or area 2, or essentially Robbinsdale, Crystal, and the south part of Brooklyn Park, where we are running in Highway 81 right away, how that route compared and measured against the goals, how the Lowry Washington Avenue route in the next column rated against the goals, and how the Lyndale West Broadway route rated against the goals. And you can see there's no poors anywhere here. That's not a surprise. We very deliberately chose locations where we believed LRT would fit or LRT would make sense. We didn't pick routes, especially in the Minneapolis section, that had like Penn, which had previously been screened out, or like Lyndale north of West Broadway, which we knew were very limited in size. So that's not a surprise. We saw a lot of goods in here, and what you'll see is that a number of rankings in area 2 were rated as excellent, and 3 of the goals versus 1 of the goals were rated as excellent on West Broadway versus Lowry. So what we want to do today, so partly you didn't see a column in there for area 1. We did not rate the area 1 route portion, or in essence, the West Broadway section, where it's essentially the same as the previous project. We did not rate that against the goals. Number one, we already know that meets the goals. That was all part of the original project. Secondly, we haven't really made any changes in area 1 from the West Broadway alignment from Oak Grove Station to 93rd to 85th and to Brooklyn Boulevard. That's all maintained under its previous design, and so that area is not rated as part of the draft report. So we are going to take a look at 2 of the goals tonight and how each of these area 2 and then the 2 routes in area 3 rate against those goals. So the first one is about the goal of improving transit access and connections to jobs and regional destinations. Kind of the bread and butter or meat and potatoes of what must be close to dinner time, of what these, what an LRT or a transit improvement would mean. Will there be ridership? Will we serve people that have limited access to using vehicles and depend on transit? Do we serve off-peak times? Do we serve reverse commute situations? Is it really truly a transit improvement that serves those things and not just commuter transportation, so to speak? Do we have good linkages to other modes and to other transit systems, like the existing ABRT lines and like the remainder? And then do we have access to the kind of destinations that people utilize transit for, like jobs and housing and healthcare and school? And so what we'll see in terms of our analysis is that for area 2 along Highway 81 in Brooklyn Park, Crystal, and Robbinsdale, that we find that segment to be excellent against this goal. It serves North Memorial Hospital. It serves downtown Robbinsdale. It serves the commercial areas and residential areas around Bass Lake Road and 63rd. The density of potential riders, the density of destinations in terms of shopping and schools and residential properties is very good through here. Also, a high concentration of jobs. And so, as a corridor for a major transit improvement, this segment of Area 2 rates as excellent. In the Minneapolis segments against Goal 1, we have both Lowry and West Broadway, and you'll see the Lowry route rates as excellent as well. We're going through a very dense area of the city of Minneapolis, and then down along Washington Avenue, we provide connections around Upper Harbor Terminal. We provide connections in the North Loop. We have high service to residential neighborhoods and high service to residential neighborhoods with limited income and residents of color. And so in that matter, a transit improvement along the Lowry, Washington in Goal 1 rates as excellent. Similarly, West Broadway also rates as excellent. Very similar statistics. That's the next slide, guys. Thank you. Again, very high concentration of residents and residential properties, many of them which are lower income households and residents of color, a lot of transit dependent use already within this area, a lot of cultural and community destinations in and around here as well, and really serving the heart of the North Minneapolis cultural and commercial corridor. And so all three of these, Area 2 along 81, and then either Lowry or West Broadway would be excellent in terms of meeting Goal 1 of a transit improvement. Goal 5, the other one we're going to take a little bit of a look at today, is a little bit different. This one is the goal of this project, promoting healthy communities, providing sound environmental practices, which would include efforts to address climate change and minimizing impacts to environmental, natural, and cultural resources. So those are part of the measures here. How we would connect to things like recreation areas, healthy food options, health and environmental benefits, how we potentially would meet climate action plans and reduce vehicle miles traveled are the elements around Goal 5. So within Area 2, that evaluation for us finds this as good. It doesn't quite reach excellent. It does rate as good, providing LRT within an existing transportation facility like Highway 81 does minimize environmental impacts. It minimizes additional impacts to wetlands. It minimizes additional impacts to parks. It provides opportunities to improve other transportation modes. We believe LRT through this area would be a measure of implementing the county's climate action plan and the state's action plan, and does and will help in the goal that we have at Hennepin County of reducing vehicle miles traveled. It provides access to parks. It provides access to grocery stores like the Hy-Vee in Robbinsdale. But there is certainly some park impacts, both in Robbinsdale and around North Memorial. Going to need some review, going to need to deal with those pieces, air noise impacts as well. So this rates as good. Within Minneapolis, the Lowry portion, we rated as good as well. Again, it's a street running LRT. It doesn't have a lot of overall additional environmental impacts because we're building it in the street, and it does provide access to regional parks along portions of it. But there are certainly construction and some, like I say, noise and air and other environmental impacts that we'll have to deal with. We also would expect this route to reduce vehicle miles traveled as well. And again, similarly with West Broadway. West Broadway has many destinations along it. There's the Cub Foods and other grocery stores along the segment of West Broadway. It's very close to North Commons Park and other regional parks, and so that provides an asset for serving that. We would expect a little more vehicle miles traveled reduction with regard to West Broadway than we had previously on the Lowry route. But again, it's a very tight street. There'll be a lot of environmental impacts associated with impacts to right-of-way and adjacent properties that we are going to have to work through. And so it doesn't really reach the level of excellence. So each of these three routes, in summary, kind of each of these three routes helps provide what we would consider a climate-friendly and healthy-friendly transportation alternative, but they also do have their levels of environmental impacts as well. And so they don't rate as excellent, but as good. So those are just two of the 6 goals. And if you have an opportunity to see the report or to look at some of the details there, you can find a little more detail about each of the other goals. What does that leave us then? Where does that leave us now? We are in the middle of this 45-day comment period on the draft report. So we've had numerous in-person open houses where we've had people attend over the last couple of weeks. We've also had a couple virtual, and thanks to all of you for attending this virtual workshop tonight. You can hear some of this background and hopefully comment on your thoughts, positive, negative, whatever you think about West Broadway versus Lowry, which one you feel is a better choice, how you feel about Area 2, how you feel about any of these pieces. Very important for us to have those. Those comments, as well as all of our previous background work, will help guide the development of a final route modification report, which we'll hope to then put together that'll recommend a community-supported route for Blue Line extension from Target Field Station to Brooklyn Park, not using BNSF Railroad right-of-way. And as we pull that together into its final form, then as that moves forward, we would then begin our environmental work in the summer, which then kind of leads us forward into all of the work we need to do a further, deeper study of the chosen alternative. What are the impacts? What are the mitigation measures? And how to move this piece forward. I see we have a hand. Can we just finish keep your question tight. If we just finish these few slides on anti-displacement, we will move right into some questions. Because the last piece we want to visit on is our work on anti-displacement. Sophia, do you want me to do this piece? Do you want to take this piece?
I can take it real quick, Dan.
Thank you.
Give your voice a break for a second, and we're starting to get questions in chat, so we'll key them up right after, as you said. But basically, as we started, early engagement efforts, one of the things that we heard very clearly is that putting in comprehensive set of strategies that make sure that this line benefit the community that exists along the corridor today, especially those that would be potentially sensitive to economic pressures, like if rents went up or things like that. A small business renting a space or something like that, equivalent to that. And so, the project team agreed with what we heard in the community very strongly, right? Is that we are building this project for existing transit riders, and we have a project goal of advancing regional equity. And so with that, we looked at ways that we could really make sure that we could bring those benefits to the community. And we knew we needed a little bit of help. So we have set out to contract with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota to kick off an anti-displacement working group that will conduct research and put together recommendations over the next 18 months. The project manager is C. Terrence Anderson, who's leading this work, and the group will be comprised of a whole bunch of folks that will help us ensure that we could actually move something forward. So bringing government to the table with community members, with philanthropy, with businesses to really kind of think about how all the pieces can fit together, and to make sure that when the group produces recommendations, that they can be implemented. That's actually part of my next slide. I jumped ahead, but just an important part of it. We are accepting applications, Kira is accepting applications until tomorrow. So if you're interested in being a part of this work, you can fill out that form and kind of proceed with that. What the group will be doing is developing implementable recommendations that the project team can continue to move forward. Like I said, part of the structure of the group is to work through existing tensions to make sure that things that maybe be needed to implement in the future kind of get in line with each other. And I think that's basically, that concludes our presentation portion. So we already have a couple questions in chat. I know we had a hand up, but let me start with Dan. I think this is a question for you, and you just lost video, by the way. I hope that's just with me. But I think the individual heard the term vehicle households. I think you're referring to 0 cars, 0 vehicle households, and why we evaluate that.
Thanks. I see Liz, it says Liz put that one in the chat. Yeah, I might have maybe went too fast. Usually what we refer to as 0 car households, or identifying households that do not by choice or not by choice, don't have access to a vehicle, and therefore are more apt to utilize transit. And so that is prevalent along some areas of the corridor. Not vehicles that have a car, vehicles that do not have access to a car.
Liz, did you want to follow up with that? I see you shaking your head.
Liz, we cannot hear you.
I'll take the next question and give
Now
you a
it looks
sec.
unmuted.
Yeah, you're unmuted. It says unmute on our end. Type it. Okay, I'll take the next question as you're kind of adding that to the chat. So the next question is from Mike, and he asks, "Are you still contemplating an elevated track on along West Broadway in North Minneapolis?" And he's actually asking because he's concerned if that's still on the drawing board.
The answer to that, Mike, good question. We did draw up and provide some possibilities. What we found as we presented that at a number of sessions is that the size of a structure to build an elevated section over West Broadway, the impacts on the adjacent properties and the distance around them really did not come off favorably. And so we have not gotten any real positive benefits about why an elevated section through the north side would make sense. And so nothing's really on or off the drawing board, but it's really not being contemplated as an option moving forward in North Minneapolis along West Broadway any longer.
I'll take the next question, which is Liz Fry says, "I live in North Minneapolis and there's a rich density of people of color. What portion of folks have participated in this discussion so far would you say are Northsiders and are people of color? Also, did residents of North Minneapolis have a say in having Cura involved?" And I'll take the first one and then the second one, which is we've been heavily involved, engaged with residents on the north side through a variety of methods, both attending community events, participating in kind of one-on-one conversations. We've done a lot of door knocking and chatting with like the businesses, working through organizations. We've had a community cohort, as we call them, contracted to help further engagement, and they represent various neighborhood or cultural organizations to help further that reach. And we track kind of what we consider EJ population, so people of color, folks that various groups that you have to pay attention to in particular. And overall, we've had many conversations that fit into that category. So a lot of intentional efforts to be very inclusive and targeted to make sure that we're hearing from diverse voices. To the second question of how did we pick Kira? How was that decided? How all of that process was involved. And so when we solicited RFPs, so requests for proposals for Kira, we have a community and business advisory committee. And both of those committees have representatives from each of the cities along the alignment, as well as appointments from Met Council in Hennepin County. Those are also residents that are along the line. And we had representatives from that group basically review the applications with us to make sure that the community voice was included in selecting the consultant. We also, before we even asked for RFPs or requests for proposals, we solicited feedback on kind of what should be included and possible groups that we should reach out to that could do this work. And so that was all kind of part of the process to select them. But really, I wanted to be very transparent overall in that work. And for those that don't know Kira, they have quite a long history of doing this type of work. One of their main researchers, Brittany Edwards, has been very involved in this type of activity throughout her career. So not only some folks might know C. Terrence from some of his transit work before, but they have a very robust team of people. And their research model really involves not like just parachuting in and parachuting out, but a very collaborative process. It was really important for Hennepin County and the Met Council to have a third-party facilitator involved in these efforts, just so that we could help ensure that we were really taking what the community wanted at the center and allowing those discussions to happen. So, if there's tension between a government agency and what the community wanted, that could be facilitated with another consultant. So a lot of intention going into how that work was formed and kind of kicking off, but we could also expect broader community involvement in the springtime on this anti-displacement question. So they're working on seeding the group. That group will start to meet, and then they'll also be going out into the world to hear from more of you as the process progresses. That was a lot of me talking. Let me get to the next question. And Dan, I'll just have you queued up for this one, I think.
I'm ready.
There are, of course, many differences between Lowry and West Broadway, and it's hard to imagine a train on either place. But in one big difference, the two is that Lowry has a bike lane and single-family homes. How would the route impact driveways to residential and commercials, and then the bike lane itself?
So, very good question, Michael. So, you are correct. Both of these routes, Broadway, West Broadway, and Lowry, are not super wide streets. But the difference is West Broadway's got parking on some of it, and Lowry has bike lanes along a lot of it, as well as single-family home driveways. So the LRT, the proposal as it's kind of laid out now would be a light rail line would be built in the center of the street, similar to what is the situation on University Avenue or what the situation is on other streets within our system. And so not wanting to purchase a lot of additional property along there, you can imagine if we put LRT in the middle of Lowry and want to do minor widening so we don't buy a lot of single family homes, something's got to go away. And in that case, the bike route along there in some areas, maybe not in all areas, is a little wider down by 94, but in some areas would have to be relocated to a parallel or different street. And so it would not be able to be saved along the entire route. That would be something that would be lost. But how the loss of the bike lane on West Broadway would be mitigated, in other words, where would the bike route go? How would it function through that part of the city? Not yet determined. That would be part of the work in the environmental analysis. The driveways would still all be able to remain open, but as you can imagine, we would not allow track crossing for most of those driveways. In fact, any of the driveways that were not signalized. And so intersections, streets, that didn't have traffic signals, driveways would all be allowed onto Lowry, but they would all be right in, right out access points and not full access points like many of them are today. There's some medians along Lowry, but it's primarily an undivided roadway. So that is what would be lost along that piece.
Thank you for that, Dan. Going to the next question, and I'm actually in anticipation of the next one, I'm going to flip through slides, but to get to this one first, is asking which route potentially has the better travel time. So do you know if one option would add more travel time compared to the other line, i.e. would Lowry West Broadway take more time to get between the two terminuses?
Well, and I think that one can be somewhat answered based on the fact that Lowry is a little bit long. The Lowry Washington route, if you think about from its essence, the Minneapolis border, the Lowry Washington North Loop to Target Field Station is longer. It's kind of the sides of the triangle versus West Broadway over to Lyndale across 94. So that has the potential for it to be a little bit longer. And then, Sophia, I'll go right into the next question as well. You can identify on here that we identified that the West Broadway route would have a station area in and around Penn. It would have a station area in and around Emerson Fremont, and then it would have a station in and around Lyndale and Plymouth. So that's 3 stations. The Lowry route may have as many as 5. So a station at Penn, a station around Emerson Fremont, one along Washington up near Lowry, kind of a Upper Harbor Terminal area station, one along Washington at West Broadway, and then one somewhere in kind of the North Loop, Plymouth and Washington area before it comes into Target Field Station. So simply by being a little bit longer and simply by having maybe as many as 5 stops versus 3, the Lowry route would have a longer travel time. And then hopefully we've answered the next question about the proposed stops. That's where they are now, they're identified not so much as stops as station study areas, meaning the likelihood of a stop there is very high, but does it go north or south of Penn? Does it go either side of Penn? The exact alignment not quite known.
And this kind of the next question is about schedule. And it is kind of, again, comparing the two options I think in Minneapolis, which is, and they're asking if they missed it in the presentation. We didn't necessarily address this particular question. Is there a construction time difference between these two options? And maybe I'll keep that off, Dan, since maybe you're thinking a little bit. Right now, we haven't identified that there would be a difference. As Dan said, there is one route is slightly longer. There might be an additional station that likely doesn't have a substantial amount of time difference. There'll be challenges with any kind of construction, and it'll be something that we'll explore further. But it won't necessarily be the decision between the two. Anything to add with that, Dan?
No, I mean, the type of construction through the West Broadway area, through the Lowry and Washington area are very similar. We're talking about rebuilding the street and rebuilding the street with LRT within it, and then rebuilding kind of out from the outside of the sidewalks to the outside of the sidewalks. So as long as there isn't a tunnel or bridges or anything else in those areas, which there is not, the construction times would be relatively the same.
Going on to the next question, they're asking about the map showed about 3,000 residents in downtown Robbinsdale, but there are no households that have access to a vehicle, 0-car households. I find that hard to believe. I live in Robbinsdale. And then she's explaining about her mute button. And so I think maybe we're talking about just the percentage of folks that have 0-car households. I don't think we were saying that they're not, that the whole city doesn't have access to cars.
Well, I also think, if I'm not mistaken, Liz, I thought we'd talked about this. When it says there are no households that have access to a car, 0-car households, that's not, what this means is a 0-car household is one that does not have access to a car. So there likely aren't any households in Robbinsdale, downtown Robbinsdale, that are 0-car households that don't have some access to a car. I know that's a little confusing. Hopefully we got that a little cleared up.
Okay, going on to the next question, and maybe if Liz has additional, we can go back to that particular point. And I'll read this comment, which is, I love this plan line. I think it'll be a huge benefit for the area and residents. One question I had is, did you consider Broadway and Robbinsdale as an alternative to 81? I recognize it's a smaller road, but there's already some rail there in the past, and it will be better access to existing bus lines and potential stations, have better pedestrian access to downtown, etc. So Dan, maybe that was a question that we had before about West Broadway and Robbinsdale. Maybe talk about why we don't see it on the map right now.
So number one, Robbinsdale said, no way, no how are we going to put LRT on West Broadway. Secondly, it's just too narrow. I mean, it's a very small street today. It has on-street parking along both sides. It's essentially Main Street in downtown Robbinsdale. And I'm speaking mostly about the segment, say, from 36th to 42nd, which is really downtown, downtown Robbinsdale. If there was no parking along the street and light rail was in there, I mean, that certainly was not something Robbinsdale wanted to see. The city of Robbinsdale wanted to see. Not that 81 is even favored by everyone associated with this. Certainly along West Broadway was not. In the other areas, north, like up through Crystal, where you talk about access to Target, it just doesn't have the available space like we believe is available on Highway 81 to serve it there. So yes, it was considered, but it was taken off the table fairly early.
Going to the next question. It's with new federal money allocated for transportation to the railroads, does that open up any possibility of new negotiations for the 8 miles? And this person is expressing that they would prefer the rail corridor. So maybe give some background of all the things that occurred with the railroad to try to get a deal, and then just kind of how the step that we've moved forward, we're really not going back at this point. If you want to go into that, Dan?
Well, again, I think as the question states, yeah, there's a lot of potential federal infrastructure money for many things, including transit, including roadways, and including railroads. But unfortunately, it's never been a financial issue with regard to Burlington Northern about the use of the right-of-way. We made many inroads to things like, as we talked about it, we discussed with them often, were there things we could do as Met Council in Hennepin County to help improve their system somewhere else to make it more amenable to use their right-of-way in Robbinsdale and Crystal along the Monticello subdivision where our previous alignment was. For example, we talked about they've always wanted to potentially have a third mainline track in Fridley. Could we provide funding in our purchase of the use of their corridor to allow them to build that third main line? And that was also always declined. And so whether or not additional federal funding that allows them to make different improvements on their system would allow them to open negotiations, I don't know. We're not hearing from them. Are our policymakers willing to use that as a catalyst to call them back and see if they're interested? I don't know. That's certainly something we can review with our county board members and Met Council members. I don't see that as a high possibility.
Yeah, I think it's important to note at this stage of the process too, going back to previous designs really aren't an option. now we have promises to deliver the project as we are presenting tonight. So it's kind of the path forward on that. So the next question is about construction and basically the impacts to businesses during construction and potentially the economic impact after the line is up and running. And so maybe there's multiple parts, I think, to this question. And first to state that construction is impactful, right? It causes inconveniences. You have to make sure that there's access. Sometimes it's noisy. So we know that as we get to construction, we need to have programs in place to support businesses through the duration of construction. So that program isn't fully in place yet, but we have lessons learned as well as hearing from businesses what has helped during construction. Some of it is can be as simple as developing access plans, helping with marketing. Other things might be dollars to help with capital improvements or remodeling, etc. So it'll be an ongoing process. Once the line is open, businesses within a station area often see a lot of benefit. So you have people coming and going in the area. It provides access for employees to reach work, and a whole other slew of potential gains. Dan, anything you want to add on that front?
No, I think impacts during construction is a huge issue. It's a huge issue to residential properties. It's a huge issue to businesses. How that work gets done, how the construction gets conducted, how we keep doors open and business and both vehicles and pedestrians and other forms of travel into and out of businesses is a very critical element along this entire alignment from the Target North Campus all the way to downtown. And it'll be different in all the different areas. We have a lot of experience with that on how we performed construction along University Avenue. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. We need to take our lessons learned from that and really help businesses thrive. We got an interesting discussion yesterday about the potential of an idea of temporary relocating businesses. Could that ever be an option where a business temporarily relocates during construction in a vacant spot somewhere and then comes back to their home base as the project gets completed? And those are just the kind of things that we can look at as we look at impacts from construction.
So I'm going to N. Anderson has a hand up and also a question in chat. So I can either read your question or feel free right now to unmute and ask. Okay, hand went down. So I will just take the question and I'll come back to the question from Concerned Citizen. So with all your interactions as it pertains to North Businesses neighborhood, what has been the feeling towards the LR, which is light rail? We never hear what those findings are. And so as we've done engagement, we have every quarter of our engagement report online. So you are free to go to our website and basically see all the feedback that we've gotten throughout the process. The same here as we get to this draft report. We're getting comments through our comment form. Those will all be kind of an appendix to our final report. So you'll be able to basically read everything that people have sent into us. And the kind of pull out some of the themes of what we're hearing about light rail is a fair amount of support and just kind of a framework of support around those efforts. So things like if investment and development is happening, how can the businesses that are currently there benefit from those investments? Or what we were just talking about, how we provide support during construction so that people are able to be around and continue to function well after the LRT is finished. Or kind of other efforts kind of along those lines. So a really robust set of feedback. And then we've also had very like site-specific conversations with various businesses and things like that that we've pulled into our design work. That's kind of a small summary and as well as a way to kind of a way to dive deeper into what we've been hearing. Okay.
Sophia, you might have missed the question right above that one from my favorite friend on this call, Concerned Citizen.
Yep, I had mentioned I'd go back to it since the hand up and the comment below were the same person. And this one is from, as Dan said, from Concerned Citizen, and it's asking, do you evaluate how violent crime may affect operations and performance of the Blue Line as we evaluate these routes? And so crime is not one that we use as a metric to help us decide between the two. No matter what communities are experiencing, everybody deserves transit improvement. And often investments like LRT are a way to help communities, right? So if you think of the root of what folks what causes crime, access to jobs and educational opportunities through a transit investment, and things that basically disparity reduction, right, are all part of the picture. As we think of the design itself of the LRT, we'll be doing a lot of things to make sure that stations and pedestrian access feel safe. So that is station cameras and lighting and pedestrian crossings and having safe pedestrian crossings, as well as kind of the operational considerations that you have when you open the line. So hiring additional Metro Transit police and support staff that help all work to address safety on an ongoing basis. I think that got that question. I'll go on to the next one. And Dan, I'll just assume it's for you, even though I haven't fully read it yet. Does the Lowry option run along Washington Avenue on the north side? What is the density on the east side of 94 that portion of the route? Mostly industrial from my perspective. Lowry 94 would hug the route, posing a geographic barrier to the high density residential neighborhoods on the west. So I think that's more of a comment for us, and we can talk about that specifically, is that we've kind of even identified that the river and 94 act as barriers potentially to accessing the stations. And that is part of what we'll continue to evaluate. Dan, anyways?
Sophia, have I lost my camera?
Nope, I can see you.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, that's a really good point that Bob makes here, because when we looked at this, the key was a Lowry route running along Lowry. But one of the things you got to do to have a route along Lowry is you've got to get there. You've got to get there from downtown. So we looked at a number of north-south routes to do that. Obviously, Penn and Emerson Fremont will have the C and D lines that will run arterial BRT. Plus, they're not real narrow, or they're not real wide routes. We also, you can see the West Broadway route comes from downtown and comes up Lyndale. We also looked at the idea of taking Lyndale north up to Lowry from West Broadway. Very narrow, would have required significant right-of-way acquisition of single-family homes along Lyndale. So while we would certainly concur with all of your statements, it's really running up Washington Avenue, because, I mean, we also looked at 94. What if we just ran up the center of 94 on bridges above or something like that? And that really wasn't an environment that was really conducive to wanting to provide a transit improvement as well. So it became the best of the not greatest options. It allowed us to maybe get through North Loop and have a station there along Washington and Plymouth, but then really doesn't, I would agree, serve the denser of the neighborhoods just on the other side of 94. And so that's really how we got to where we are.
The next question is about access to grocery stores. And so the commenter is mentioning that we mentioned access to Cub Foods, I think on West Broadway, and just noting that how we place the station study area could be quite far away, and kind of speaking to that usefulness. And kind of on this map, the Cub Foods, the hand doesn't even get small enough for it, but it's basically kind of on that corner as we make the turn. So the station could be actually quite close to the grocery store. Anything to add with
So
that?
Ron, good observation. So there's a couple things, right? When we look at where a West Broadway station will be in this area, serving Cub Foods is important, but so is serving a direct connection between the Blue Line and the D Line, which is going to run on Emerson and Fremont. So do we hug closer to Emerson and Fremont? Do we hug closer to Cub Foods? Do we try to stay somewhere in the middle? I mean, that'll all be part of the final design aspects. Cub is one of the things because it's a food area with a significant grocery store. It's definitely a destination that's important. I can't tell you how many times I've ridden along Central Corridor and seen people coming from the Target store or the Cub store on University Avenue because they have significant groceries there and utilize LRT. So that's important, but so is the connection to the C and D or the D line. So we'll have to balance that out and kind of minimize, total distances to either one and try to maximize those benefits.
We have another comment in chat that is echoing the previous question that we had, and I'll just read it real quick for everybody's benefit. He's just seconding the comment about basically Washington Avenue between Lowry and Plymouth, that it has auto shops and metal fabrication and etc. And it doesn't feel for this commenter that it's not the type of establishment that is served by light rail or the best kind of connection there, and that 94 is a barrier for the residential areas to the west. So for folks that would be coming from those residential areas trying to access the stations. Going to the next question from I just lost it, from the Imam. Sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. He's asking about basically investment to impacted areas along the project and what could that look like? Is it just right along the line, or could it extend deeper into the community? Kind of a multi-part question, and there's multiple ways that we kind of parse that out. So there's kind of like direct benefits, like the improvements to infrastructure that kind of concentrated along the line, thinking about the pedestrian environment, sometimes utilities that are within the street. There's also mitigation that comes out of our environmental studies, and then what could come out of the anti-displacement work and how broad that could be for the community hasn't fully been identified yet. We're still very early in that process. I need to have a very deep conversation with the community. We've had conversations, for example, about jobs training programs, or especially ones that target younger people. And we have past practices. Metro Transit already has a jobs program that we could lean into and expand. And so there's kind of a list that we're already starting to track as options, but a lot of work still left to do. Anything else to include with that question, Dan?
No, I just think that, it's hard to say exactly how deep within the community an investment like this will be, but certainly within what I would call walking distance of the stations, we will see investment that comes in for housing or retail or commercial. And we've seen that in areas along University Avenue. I can certainly say that even in some of the station areas that got added towards the end, some level of investment, private, sometimes with public financing and sometimes without, went in along many areas, and then in other areas close to LRT as well. So it does hopefully provide a economic development stimulus to any area where it's built, as well as the transportation improvement that it's doing.
And we would be very happy to continue this conversation with you and kind of the interest that you have in this topic as well, going forward. I'll take the next question now. And I think this commenter has identified a next step that the project team also needs to engage in terms of both pedestrian crossings. So I'll read the comment. Crosswalks are already in severe shortage on Lowry, and we frequently have people dangerously jaywalking across the street at random locations between traffic. The Lowry proposal would seem to exacerbate this issue. How would you help pedestrians safely cross whatever street the line ends up on? So one of the things, as Dan kind of thinks about his part of the answer as well, is kind of the mid-block crossing option. And we have some examples online at university, how that has worked and how you can make a very safe crossing for people to kind of get across the road. So that would be part of the equation that we would have. So you have your signalized intersections, and then how do you deal with unsignalized intersections, and making sure that you have enough pedestrian crossings so people can get around the neighborhood. I think on both routes, there's gaps that we need to kind of fill in terms of identifying those pedestrian crossings. Dan, what would you like to add to that?
I mean, I would add that if we build an LRT down the street, and there's a train now that runs down the street, we want to minimize unprotected jaywalking type crossings along the street, both because of vehicle traffic and because of the train. So in order to do that, you have to then put in an adequate number of safely designed, signed, and signalized pedestrian crossing locations so that someone that comes up to Lowry from the neighborhood doesn't say, I'm not going to walk 6 blocks down there to a safe crossing. I'm just going to cross. So it can't be too far away that anybody that comes up to Lowry either is in close proximity that they can access either a traffic signalized crossing that's at an intersection with a traffic signal, or an unsignalized, signed and striped crossing that provides both safe roadway street crossing and track crossing as well. Where all those locations would go, how they would be spaced, what the exact signing configuration will be, are all design details to be done. But this is a very, very important point, because if you do not provide an adequate number of safe locations for people to cross, then they will cross wherever. You're not going to stop everyone, but it will cause even logical thinking pedestrians to cross in unsafe spots, and that's what we don't want to have.
Changing topics a little bit, going to one that we haven't talked about yet, which is funding. The person's asking about how projects of this magnitude are funded, and kind of if people are wondering if it's coming out of their pockets. And I'll take the first part and then let Dan kind of take the second part of how we fund it. But the first part that I'll mention is that nearly 50% of this project funding comes from the federal government. And it's from a pocket of money that's dedicated to the New Starts program. And so it's specifically for transit improvements. And so a project like this brings basically potentially $1 billion to the state that would otherwise would go elsewhere around our country. So, it's leveraging federal dollars to help benefit our local communities. But we also have to provide our local share, and Dan, maybe jump into that part and what Hennepin County's funding.
Sure. I mean, obviously, this is a public project, right? So therefore, we're using public funding, which means it all comes from the public through whatever kind of taxes there may be. Sophia's right that here in Minnesota, these projects utilize what's called capital investment grant funds from the federal government. It's federal money. It's federal funding that isn't always coming to our state, but if we qualify, we would get those costs. And so that doesn't mean it isn't public and that you haven't paid for it. But that is how we get a good portion of the funds. The local share, which is usually about half, and let's be clear here. When we talk about this, we're talking about a project that would cost anywhere from 1.5 to $2 billion to build. The local share primarily comes from Hennepin County sales and use taxes, which is the additional sales tax that is collected within all of Hennepin County for the purpose of implementing transit improvements. Right now, that is the purpose. It's a half a percent of the local sales tax that people pay within Hennepin County. That's collected by Hennepin County for the sole purpose of making transit improvements within the county, this being one of them. So that's really the majority of the funding. There's also sometimes state funding within some. There's some local city dollars in these projects as well. But the two primary sources are Hennepin County sales and use tax and federal dollars.
Thank you for that. Going on to the next question, we're getting into a design question, which is how is accessibility for folks with disabilities going, as well as safety for pedestrians? And I would like to first note that both of those two things are absolutely critical for our design. We want our stations to be fully accessible for all individuals, whatever their abilities are. And having pedestrians safely access the stations is critical. And one of the things that we do once we get further into design is we do a lot of workshops with our Transportation Accessibility Advisory Committee to really dive into those designs and make sure that we're meeting those needs. Dan, maybe talk about some of the features that we have on stations and how we ensure that folks can access across streets and things.
Well, certainly all of our areas, all of our station areas, for example, are fully accessible for wheelchairs. So while there may be a step here or there are also ramps everywhere to provide areas along the entire piece. There are why can't I think of the name now? The tactile warning edges along all of the station platforms that identify that it's near the edge of the station. We have all of the devices that are located on stations accessible for wheelchair users, and railings and all of those things, as well as, when we provide track crossings, there isn't a gap in there where you can lose a wheel in there as well. So it's just all of the things that we build, including access and including the trains where there's a handicapped accessible seating on the trains as well. All those elements are built in to every project. We are using federal funding and county funding here, so we are following everything associated with providing accessibility.
Kind of the next section of comments are a little bit of discussion that folks are having in chat, and I will just read it off for folks' benefit. And one commenter was just noting that appreciated the explanation of kind of all the options that we explored kind of next to Washington and the trade-offs for doing that. And then one commenter also noted that the Washington alignment will pass under the Upper Harvard Terminal, which will have dense housing and commercial spaces at a performance venue. It's not there now, but it'll be in place closer to, sorry, misread that sentence there. It's not there now, but by the time this line is in place, it'll be closer to reality. And that is why we note that development as well, as we're evaluating this route to make sure that we're capturing a known future development. Yeah, and thank you for the conversation on investment. It's one that we really want to continue to have, and would love to meet with you further to hear your thoughts on that as well. So next question is that we've given a good explanation of, sometimes the chat moves. You've given a good explanation of what would be potentially lost on Watts Broadway to make room for the rail, asking for a similar conversation on West Broadway. And Dan, maybe talk about lanes and parking changes, and then as well as kind of our pinch point and the options that we're exploring between Lindale and the school headquarters.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I mean, yeah, we talked about potentially loss of the bike lane up on Lowry. Really, what gets lost on Broadway is without buying a lot of properties, if we have LRT in the center, and we have a roadway on either side, each direction, really pretty much all of the existing on-street parking on West Broadway would have to go away. So again, similar to what we talked about with the bike lanes, now if we lose the on-street parking on West Broadway, how does the project mitigate that? Do we provide some surface lots in and along West Broadway in certain commercial nodes for businesses? Do we beef up off cross street parking? How do we deal with that loss? So that's one. Secondly, again, center running LRT would still require that many of the driveways and unsignalized cross streets that are there today would become right in, right out. There's many more signals on West Broadway today, and so a lot of those would stay open, but we would lose that full access on some of those streets. And we've got a very tight area on West Broadway between Lindale and Irving. And to try to fit in a roadway in both directions on West Broadway, left turn lanes for all the traffic signalized intersection, a station platform, and LRT on West Broadway, as well as adequate sidewalks. To try to squeeze all that in there may require the acquisition of a lot of businesses. That's not in our goals, and so we've looked at potentially splitting LRT between West Broadway and 21st, and so leaving West Broadway as a two-way street between Lindale and Irving, and having one direction of LRT on West Broadway and one direction of LRT on 21st, one block to the north. We've also have an option that would put LRT on 21st and leave West Broadway as a street and separate those two by one block. Splitting West Broadway into a two-way pair, having LRT in one direction on West Broadway and the other direction of traffic on 21st. So there are also one of kind of maybe shifting to the north and saving businesses on one side and impacting some on the other. So there's a lot of different choices in there. And so the pros and cons of those will be kind of worked out again through the ongoing environmental and design process.
Thanks. Moving on to the next question. It's the person is asking about our projected ridership, and particularly kind of breaking down segments. Gave the example of how many people would head from downtown Minneapolis out to like the Target site in Brooklyn Park, and that's a really good tee off that improving the reverse commute is actually something that is evaluated in a goal of this project, because there's a lot of jobs there's a lot of jobs in downtown Minneapolis, and there will continue to will be, but there's also jobs in the suburbs that people are trying to access. Dan, why don't you take the other part of that question?
Well, the ridership is, we don't have enough details to actually know what the ridership for these new routes will be. We expect it will be very similar to the ridership that was generated for the previous alignment. And when we know more about what that is, and I don't want to get this wrong. I want to say, I thought the projected ridership was in like the 26,000 rides a day measurement, but I don't know that I want to quote the wrong number. So we expect it to be very close. One of the things we're learning is the FTA, the federal government, which kind of ranks our projects by ridership. I'm learning that they are saying that utilizing projected ridership in pre-pandemic numbers is somewhat justified, because the belief is the pandemic numbers and currently how roadways are operating is expected to return much more to normal than it is operating at right now. And so what that ridership will be and how that will be considered is still a very open question right now. I will say that we believe that ridership will be very close to the alignment that we had before, and that secondly, that we believe that ridership will return to kind of the pre-pandemic numbers and usefulness of what we'd had before.
Going to the Robbinsdale section of the line, we have a comment from an individual, but I think there's a question in there as well for us, and they're concerned with the change and had preferred the alignment on the former railroad track and worried about basically connectivity in Robbinsdale with the new line, making it difficult to cross. And they are noting access for emergency vehicles. So let's talk a little bit about how basically none of the intersections in Robbinsdale are going to be closed, as well as how the train interacts with emergency vehicles, if you wouldn't mind, Dan.
Well, again, I mean, certainly noted the comment. We've certainly heard from numerous people about in Robbinsdale about the former alignment is more preferable to us than utilizing County Road 81. As far as crossing for both emergency vehicles and pedestrians, I mean, I think what Sophia says is right, is that the current traffic signalized intersections in Robbinsdale, Abbott 36th, 35th, 40th, 41st, 42nd, will all continue to be signalized pedestrian crossing locations as well. Emergency vehicles will continue to have emergency vehicle preemption. They will preempt the traffic signals. Vehicles will stop, the train will stop, and they will have the right of way. LRT will operate by the traffic signals. So if a pedestrian has a walking ability to cross the street, the train will stop. And so that's very consistent with operation in other locations along here.
And another commenter, I think echoing the previous comment that they preferred the previous route and don't want it on 81. Going back to another question, it's wondering if there'll be cost to park on West Broadway with any changes that we would make.
Good question. Unknown. I mean, to date, when we've talked to the city, there's been no talk of should we put in meters in various spots? Would these be pay ramps or free? I think the idea is to mitigate what's lost. And so, if it's free parking today along West Broadway, how would we find a way to provide free parking in the future? And so I can't answer that absolutely, but that's really the direction we would look to head.
Another comment from Robbinsdale, and this person is saying we're very excited about the potential to get light rail service to Robbinsdale, and looking specifically at the station that would potentially serve the business district. They're noting that we had a park and ride by Hubbard Marketplace in the previous designs, and if we have any proposals for that in the new designs.
Well, that's a great question. We do have a proposal. So we had a proposed on the previous line. We had a proposed downtown Robbinsdale station, and it was by Hubbard Marketplace, and it was over by EMI. And so the idea was to build a fairly significant, about a 550 car park and ride where the existing EMI building is, the former Robbinsdale Farm and Garden building there, and provide that for park and riders with access to the station. In considering a route on 81, the demand is still there for park and ride. We don't believe that a park and ride of that size is necessary along an 81 alignment, 500 or so spaces. That's pretty big. But we think not providing a park and ride of some kind has the potential to allow commuters to spill parking into the downtown area. And so we're proposing somewhere in the proximity of downtown, either maybe around the Robbins Center or down around Elam Church, somewhere a small park and ride that could serve folks that wanted to come in, park, and then ride north or south from there.
Oh, I was going to read the next question, and then it went to the next one. That we just have one commenter that's suggesting that we put the link for future virtual meetings right on our homepage versus the meeting tab. I think that's a great idea. We'll take that under advisement, as well as making sure that we're providing QR codes so that people can link more quickly. And we got that feedback last night as well, and we'll take both into considerations for future meetings. We want these to be as accessible as possible, and we're always happy to hear the ways that would help people out. So thank you for both. Let me see if there's this person is saying I'm in the 5-minute zone for the option on West Broadway, so it's preferred for him. Either of these is much better for me than the previous plan, though, which pretty much went around North Side. Thank you for providing that feedback. While it was disappointing that for some neighborhoods that we had to modify the plan, it did give us an opportunity to potentially serve even more folks and more of the heart of North Minneapolis, and that is our goal as we move forward. I think we have time for one more last question if anybody has it. But while folks are maybe thinking of their last comments, I'll just put in a pitch that we are accepting comments through January 25th. If you have thoughts after this meeting and want to provide comments on our comment form, on our interactive map, or emailing me directly, my email is on our website. We greatly encourage your comments. All of the questions and comments that you have shared to us tonight have been captured by Carolyn and will be included as part of our project record and attached to our appendix of our report. And one last comment came through. It says, I live in North Minneapolis near West Broadway. Super excited for this to serve North Minneapolis. I'm rooting for West Broadway. Thank you for making this meeting available. Thank you for that feedback, and thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to talk to us more about this project. If any of you represent organizations or even just want to have a conversation with a few of your neighbors, in addition to writing comments, please feel free to reach out to project staff to come out to you and discuss more. And so with that, I think we had one more question. So I think we'll take that before we close it out. And it's, if parking mitigation occurs, what would that be? Would that cost included in the project, or would it be funded separately? And I think our desire would be to potentially pull it into project costs as a kind of a mitigation effort. Dan, anything else you wanted to add on that front?
Well, I could probably talk for that for a while, but I mean, one of the things will be, okay, now who's going to own this parking, right? I mean, so if it could be funded, certainly could be funded by the project. I think that's a less difficult question to answer than who's going to own and maintain it in the future. Is it going to be by the city? Is it going to be by the county? Is it going to be a Metro Transit asset? I mean, typically it might be city, but then at the same time, where's their funding to maintain it? So lots of, I think if we looked at it as parking provided on the project as mitigation for on-street parking, it would be eligible for project funding. That part is clear, but how and where and who owns it, lot to come on that.
I think we're at the end, and so I'll thank everybody again for spending time with us tonight. While we're close to making a decision on a route, we're just at the beginning of the process, and really look forward to hopefully seeing many of you again in the future and getting into even greater detail as we figure out all about how this project can best serve the community. So project staff is here We, like I said, please feel free to provide additional comments and to reach out with us to have more discussion, et cetera, et cetera. Have a safe and peaceful evening. And with that, good night.
Thanks, everyone.